So Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Singapore meeting his counterpart Lawrence Wong, the Prime Minister of Singapore. It is an extremely packed day for Prime Minister Narendra Modi today as he wraps up his tour of Southeast Asia. Remember, he was in Brunei before, now he's in Singapore. This is the last day of his visit to Southeast Asia. But this is really an action-packed visit, especially when it comes to Singapore. Lots of major agreements signed between India and Singapore. They've agreed to elevate their bilateral relationship as well. So let's get into it. Let's explain what's going on as we explained to you with Brunei. Let's go with why Prime Minister Modi was in Brunei. Let's explain what he's doing in Singapore, why Prime Minister Narendra Modi is interested in this small country of around 6 million people. Why has the Prime Minister chosen to visit there? So essentially, let's start with why Singapore matters to India before we get into the nitty-gritty of what the Prime Minister is doing there. Essentially, there are a couple of big reasons why Singapore matters. Number one is trade and investment. Singapore is, as you may know, one of the world's big gateways for financial capital. Is one of the capitals of the global financial industry, and a large amount of FDI that comes into India comes in from Singapore. So it's a very, very important zone for financial flows into India. So trade, investment, financial flows, etc. This is something that Singapore is very important for, and India values Singapore a great deal for that. We have had lots of cooperation when it comes to financial technologies, whether that is with linking the UPI, India's UPI, to Singapore's Pay Now, whether that is trying to get Singaporean companies to come into India and invest in India, as well as just trying to understand how Singapore's financial flow and markets work. So absolutely, FDI is a big part of India's interest in Singapore. The second segment of things that India is interested in is the diplomatic and strategic partnership. Remember that Singapore is a country that has been very important for opening up ASEAN and Southeast Asia for India. Remember that if we go back just a little bit, if I could tell you the story of why this is important, because we don't dwell on this enough, which is that in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, which was this big strategic confrontation between America and the Soviet Union, which has since become Russia, what you had was India woke up and realized that actually it had very, very few strategic partnerships with key countries to the east, to its east. So whether you're looking at Singapore or Japan or South Korea or Southeast Asian nations, India woke up and realized that actually we don't have very strong partnerships in that part of the world. We had largely focused on, let's say, the Soviet bloc and communist nations and so on. And we had not managed to build a strong relationship with those parts of the world. So we came up with the Look East policy to turn India's diplomatic attention and also focus on countries towards the east that were strategically valuable. And Southeast Asia, because it's so close to India, was a major part of that outreach. And Singapore was extremely important in opening up Southeast Asian nations to working with India. In fact, Dr. Jaishankar, who's India's foreign minister now, used to be High Commissioner to Singapore. He actually wrote an op-ed where he recounts this history and talks about how actually Singapore was so important for India in terms of reaching out to Southeast Asian nations. And to this day, it remains within ASEAN, the India coordinator. So it coordinates India's engagement with ASEAN. So absolutely an important country when it comes to the strategic and when it comes to the diplomatic side of the relationship. And also on strategy, India has gotten closer to Singapore in the last couple of years when it comes to bringing their defense forces together. You had Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Lawrence Wong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, also discuss defense cooperation, having more exercises together, working together more closely on cybersecurity. We had a defense cooperation agreement that was signed, if I remember correctly, in 2017. And so the armed forces of India, the air forces especially, exercise a lot together, work very closely together. India and ASEAN had a maritime exercise, their first maritime exercise in 2023. Singapore was a key part in coordinating that. So as you can see, this is a relationship that spans from trade and investment to defense to diplomatic issues. And of course, how can we forget, there is the massive diaspora connect as well. Remember that Singapore, just to give you a bit of a crash course, Singapore's demography and its politics is that there are three major communities in Singapore, which is the Singaporean Chinese, Malays, as well as Singaporean Indians. And the Indians, of course, came in many parts from southern India, from Tamil Nadu and so on and so forth. And so these three communities are the major communities of Singapore, and that has formed in some ways a living bridge between India and Singapore, very important part of our relationship. In fact, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, is the president of Singapore, and he is, of course, also from an Indian origin family. So there's a very deep and strong diaspora connect between India and Singapore. I could tell you a lot about the going back also the history of India and Singapore relations, how when Singapore became independent in 1965, Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, actually reached out to India first to get defense advisors. They also reached out to India to get economists to support the economic development of Singapore, but for reasons that might be well known, Singapore looked at India's planned and state-led model of development and said, we don't want that. So it's a very interesting tidbit in history that Singapore and India have always been very closely linked in this sort of way. So I've explained now why Singapore matters, given you some sense of why the Prime Minister of a country with 1.4 billion people would go to Singapore, a country of around 6 million people. So those are the key issues as such. So what has the Prime Minister been doing in Singapore thus far? Well, what we know is he's met with the Indian diaspora. A dinner was hosted for him by Prime Minister Lawrence Wong. Today, he's had meetings with top Singaporean officials talking about what India would like to get going in terms of cooperation with Singapore. He's also exchanged a number of MoUs. He is expected to visit a semiconductor facility, he has visited a semiconductor facility or is in the process of doing so, which is AEM. So he already has, my apologies. He's already visited AEM Semiconductors. We'll get into why that's important, but just keep AEM Semiconductors in your mind, and I'll explain why that's important. He's also expected to meet Lee Hsien Loong, who used to be the Prime Minister of Singapore until very, very recently, the son of Singapore's first Prime Minister as well, Lee Kuan Yew. And he's also going to be the president of Singapore, another former Prime Minister, Goh Chok Tong. So it is a absolutely packed day where he's meeting with the top leadership of the country. He's going to meet top CEOs as well to find a way to improve trade and investment flows into India. So that is what his day looks like. But let's talk about what some of the concrete deliverables have been, because that's what everyone's interested in. Well, the first concrete deliverable is that India and Singapore have just now agreed to raise their relationship to the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership. Now, this needs just a little bit of explaining, but if I can give you the Spark Notes version of what that means. When countries are close to each other, they decide to establish. So you have your ordinary diplomatic relations with countries, but there is diplomatic jargon. When countries decide to be extra special friends, they term it a strategic partnership. And so that conveys a sense of formality and a bit of diplomatic jargon to classify some relationships that are particularly important to a country. So then you have a strategic partnership. Above that, you have a comprehensive strategic partnership. So Singapore and India are now at a comprehensive strategic partnership. They've just agreed to raise that designation. And then beyond that, you have a special global strategic partnership. Then the terminology varies by country, but India has these extremely advanced partnerships with America, with Russia, with Japan. So that is terminology. Each of them differ, but what you need to know is when countries unveil a strategic partnership, it means that they've decided to formally denote their relations and push their relations in importance to the next level, so that the bureaucracies know to prioritize this relationship. And then you have a comprehensive strategic partnership, and then you have even more special, comprehensive, and global strategic partnerships. But where Singapore and India are now is the comprehensive strategic partnership. So that was one of the deliverables, that they've decided to raise the importance of the relationship in the eyes of both governments. And the second thing that they've agreed to do is sign a number of crucial agreements. And I promised to you that I'll get back to you on semiconductors. So one of the key agreements is on semiconductors. Another key agreement is on skilling. The third agreement is in the fields of health and medicine, and the fourth is on digital technology. So let's unpack a little bit of semiconductors. Now, this is something, as you might know, that India has focused on greatly. Semiconductors essentially run the global economy, from your smartphones to fighter jets. These are crucial pieces of technology that are part of most advanced pieces of technology that we see today. There are various kinds of semiconductor chips. Some of them, the cutting edge semiconductors that you see in the world today have extremely strong processing capacities, can be used for any number of advanced strategic technologies. And then there are those that are more mature chips that are used in less advanced technologies, but are nonetheless extremely important for economies to run. For example, the chip that you see in your car or in traffic lights, or so on and so forth. Now, the problem for India is that India is completely dependent on imports of chips from abroad. We do not really, while we have a great design ecosystem in semiconductors, we do not necessarily have the skills and the ability to manufacture semiconductors in India. That is something the government of India has chosen to change over the last couple of years. It has really focused on getting global firms into India to develop manufacturing facilities, fabrication facilities. They're called fabs. So fabs are manufacturing. So we have a strong design ecosystem. We want people to come and manufacture semiconductors in India through fabrication. We want packaging and testing. That's also slightly technical, but it's also part of the whole procedure of what it takes to make a semiconductor, so that India can have some level of security that it has a stake in this immensely valuable technological ecosystem. It wants to work more closely with global partners, bring this enormously valuable technological ecosystem into India, create jobs here, improve its economic security, because it doesn't want to be dependent on countries around the world for imports. And it's also going to be tremendously economically valuable as well. Now, Singapore matters because Singapore has established itself as a very important player throughout the ecosystem. In fact, around 8% of 8 to 10% of Singapore's GDP actually comes from the semiconductor industry. Some of the world's biggest semiconductor firms have presences in Singapore. So from chip design, you have MediaTek, Realtek, Qualcomm. These are some major firms, semiconductor firms that have a presence in Singapore. In assembly, packaging, and testing, you have Silicon Box, ASE Group. These are some big names in that field as well. Wafer fabrication, you have UMC. UMC, by the way, being a major Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, and you may have heard of it because, in fact, they have a cooperation agreement with Tata that they signed just a little while ago to set up a fabrication facility in India. That's part of this push that India has. So we've got Taiwan's UMC, Taiwan being absolutely dominant in the field of manufacturing advanced semiconductors. So UMC is one of the big three players in Singapore. India has got a cooperation deal, and UMC is also present in Singapore, and we've also got equipment being made in Singapore. So Singapore has steadily built up its presence in this industry since the 1960s. It's been a very crucial, very important part of this process of building up its semiconductor industry. And now India wants to work with Singapore on this on bringing companies into India, investing there, seeing whether skilling or cooperation can be done, and that is going to be extremely important for India. So semiconductors being absolutely a major part, and we've been talking to you about this for a while, that semiconductors are really going to be a key part of why Prime Minister Narendra Modi went there. He seems to have secured this cooperation agreement. Let's see what comes out of it. The other important thing that I want to talk to you about here is cooperation in the field of skilling. Now, India has wanted Singapore to set up skilling centers within India. Remember that India has a massive demographic dividend, millions and millions of young people coming into the workforce every year, but the problem is not enough of them are skilled to the level that they need to be. The economic survey, if you had the opportunity to read it this year, said some very stark things about how almost half of Indian students who come out of colleges or come out of schools are not really prepared or skilled enough to go into the workforce and contribute in the way that India would like them to. So widening India's ability to skill its own people is going to be absolutely massive, absolutely extremely important for India, and it wants to work with Singapore to develop skilling centers within India. In fact, yours truly, I had once written or broken a story about this back in, I believe, October last year, to talk about building industrial and skilling institutes in India. Skill development was a major part of why, in fact, Dharmendra Pradhan, the Minister for Education for India, also went to Singapore in May 2023, if my memory serves me correctly, to talk exactly about this issue. So that is going to be something that India is going to look at very closely. Besides that, you have digital technologies. India's UPI is, of course, linked to Singapore's Pay Now. Singapore is a very advanced country when it comes to payments and digital and financial technologies. India has wanted to expand the scope of that cooperation, bring more financial institutions in, and so you have a agreement on digital cooperation as well. So I've taken enough of your time. I have explained, I hope well, that why Singapore matters to India, what Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been doing there, what agreements he's managed to get out of the box and work with Singapore on. And of course, now He's going to move on. He's going to meet President Tharman Shanmugaratnam today. He's going to meet with Lee Hsien Loong and Goh Chok Tong, both former prime ministers. But in Singapore's political system, you are never just a former prime minister. They simply take prime ministers and make them senior ministers. So these remain enormously influential people within the Singaporean political system. So you're going to have that as well, meetings with these two top leaders, meetings with the CEO roundtable to improve on, to see how India can improve on trade and investment flows. We also have, before I let you go, we have an interview with TCA Raghavan, who used to be India's former High Commissioner to Singapore. Of course, you may know him better as India's former High Commissioner to Pakistan. He's given us a fantastic interview, which we'll be putting out for you very soon. Please do watch India Today Global for that, where he talks about the India-Singapore relationship, why Singapore is so important to India, what the two countries can do together, and also a conversation about China and how China figures into the India-Singapore relationship. It's a very interesting conversation. It's a very interesting thing said by Ambassador Raghavan. So we'll put that out for you very, very soon. But I will leave you now, and with the promise that we will come back to you with more information on the Prime Minister's visit. You can keep watching our coverage on India Today Global for the latest. Thank you so much. This is Shashank Mattu signing off on behalf of IT Global.